Welcome to our latest Hippocratic Adventures chat, where we talk about everything related to practicing medicine abroad. I'm your host, Dr. Shwini Bapat, and today we've got something really special for you. When people think about doing a private practice from abroad, people think, oh my God, that's amazing. But when they sit down to actually think about how it could work for them, most people get super anxious. They think, where do I start? How do I actually set it up? How do I get patients? Can I really do this? Is this for me? So today I'm actually sitting down with someone you probably already know from the Facebook group because he answers a lot of your questions. He's super active. And of course, that's Dr. Emeric Bojarski, co-founder of Hippocratic Adventures. And he's a child and adolescent psychiatrist who started his own telepsychiatry private practice called Equilibrium Behavioral Health, which he actually does from abroad in Portugal. We also happen to be married, so we are in the same house. We're just recording in different rooms to keep the format the same as prior vlogs. All right, so you're actually going to take us behind the scenes on what it's really like to have a telepsychiatry private practice from abroad. So it's going to be awesome, but before we get started, smash that subscribe button, sit back, and enjoy. So Emeric, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Now, look, I know you have a very busy telepsychiatry private practice now that you're doing from Portugal, and we're going to get to how life is like in Portugal shortly. But before we get to that, I actually want you to take us back to when we were actually thinking about moving abroad and you were starting to think about building your own telepsychiatry private practice that you could take abroad with you. I really want you to go back.
It's a really hard time. That was all pre-COVID and pre-telemedicine. It was kind of considered a little bit of a crazy idea at the time. So the story is that I was in my last year of fellowship and I loved outpatient psychiatry. I was clearly going to open a private practice anyways, but one of the first things that you have to think about when opening a private practice is what community you're going to serve and where you're going to live, at least in the time of an in-person private practice. And so we were thinking about living in the Boston suburbs. So we were looking for houses there, and we must have found the perfect house like 10 times over. But every time it came to putting in an offer, we just couldn't do it. There was something deeply unexciting about, getting a $500,000 mortgage that we'd pay off in the next 10 years for a house in the Boston suburbs for us. And so, yeah, we must have found that perfect house like 10 or 12 times over. And it was after we had another visit of yet another perfect house. That same night, we took the red eye to Spain for a vacation. And as we always do on these trips, within a few days, we were like, hey, what if we lived here? Because every time we take a vacation, we always get really excited about the place that we're at. And it's like, what if we lived here? And it became pretty obvious to us that we had this dream for a very long time to move abroad. And that's probably why putting in a $500,000 mortgage over 10 years in a Boston suburb was deeply unexciting. And when we came to that realization, I think it was both really, really exciting and also really scary because a private practice from abroad, like, how is that going to work? I'd done a little bit of telemedicine through some of the moonlighting that I'd done in fellowship, but telepsychiatry was not exactly very established. Remember, it was pre-COVID. It was like January 2019. So that was pretty scary. And whenever I brought up the idea with my mentors or with my colleagues, they kind of looked at me as if I was crazy. So the approach is that I'd started in-person private practice at the end of fellowship and hopefully transition it to a telemedicine private practice that we do from Portugal. hopefully a year later. But that whole thing was really scary because I was pretty much alone in doing it, right? Like no one else was doing this. Telepsychiatry was like not really a thing yet.
And so
Um,
when you realized that, maybe telepsychiatry is the way that I could practice and live abroad, how did you, and remember, this was pre-COVID, so this is definitely when people were giving you strange looks every
mhm.
time you brought it up. Not only were you trying to do telepsychiatry, but you were trying to do it from abroad. Um, so how did you actually figure out how to set up your own practice? And like you said, you did initially start with in-person visits, and then at some point you transitioned to televisits. So how did you
Mhm.
actually set up your practice? Like, did you learn from someone? How did you approach it?
Well, I was really lucky to have a lot of really good, excellent mentors actually who already had their private practices. And even though starting a private practice isn't usually something that's really extensively covered in residency or fellowship, usually you have exposures through supervisors or through other people in residency that have set up private practices. And so I had a lot of good mentors who really generously took time out of their day to show me how to start a private practice, how to get patients, and then sent me patients later on.
And so even though like private practice in psychiatry is very much part of the psychiatry tradition, this was not actually something you were taught in residency or fellowship.
Well, I remember at the Yale psychiatry residency in the fourth year, there was like one session about private practice, but it was more like what the experience is like, not how to go about setting it up. So I think most psychiatry residency and fellowship programs, at least when I was in training like 5 years ago, um, didn't have a full course in terms of, hey, here are the steps to setting up your private practice.
Okay, so you had to actually learn how to do it yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Most people who go into private practice, it's a completely foreign feeling because all of a sudden you're not working for someone else. You have to think of your private practice as a little bit of a business. You have to think about costs and revenue and marketing. And all these things are things that we're not taught in residency or in fellowship, right? Like most physicians, unfortunately, have no business knowledge. It's just not something we're taught. We're taught a lot about clinical care, but we're taught very little about how billing works or how to actually run a good, efficient business. And I think that's a little bit of a shame. I think it makes physicians easy targets of private equity, I think, as we're all aware of, but that is kind of the way it seems to be these days.
Yeah, I know that in internal medicine residency and palliative care fellowship, I never learned any aspect of business of medicine whatsoever.
Mhm.
And anything that I have learned about business has been actually since we moved abroad.
Yeah.
So I actually want to know, how long did it take you to go from that trip to Spain where you started thinking about, or like seriously thinking about
Mhm.
telepsychiatry private practice? How long did it take from that point to actually setting up your practice, to seeing your first patient, to feeling like you have enough of a busy practice to support yourself income wise?
Sure. So January 2019, we went on that trip to Spain, decided to open a private practice. My next rotation was on the inpatient unit, so I didn't have that much time to really do much of the paperwork or think a little bit about LLCs. I think I kind of waited actually until the summer. So I started setting up my practice at the same time that I was studying for my child and adolescent psychiatry boards. Um, but then by September, I had an office, I was seeing patients, and it was pretty slow at first. But the thing is with private practice is that once you get your referral network up and running, growth becomes exponential. But the first year is hard. And the first year I did a lot of moonlighting. And even when we moved abroad, I was working with a telemedicine company on the side. But I think from September 2019 to really January of 2021-ish. Is January 2021 is when I said, I'm not doing anything else other than private practice. It was more than enough to cover expenses, particularly since the cost of living is a lot less in Portugal. But by January 2021, I was pretty darn comfortable with how we were doing in private practice, and I quit everything else I was doing at the time.
And I just want to actually remind you that the first 6 months between September, when you started paying rent on your office, for the next 6 months, things were slow for you in terms of your private practice. I remember this because you would come home very worried and concerned. So I just want to highlight that the first couple of months, your practice was not full whatsoever. You had maybe a couple patients here and there, and the rest of the time you were actually filling it in with moonlighting or telemedicine gigs that you had taken up. So I just want to remind you of that as well.
I mean, it's kind of painful to go back to that point, but I also didn't know anything about marketing, right? Like, again, I hadn't been taught anything about business, or didn't really have a clear vision in terms of who my ideal patient was. I knew nothing about business, right? So my marketing sucked. It was just a bunch of trial and error. So much of that time I kind of just wasted. But over time, I think my marketing strategy got better. I really became clear on who it was that I was trying to see. And yeah, growth became exponential. But you're right, those first 6 months, most of the income that I was making was through moonlighting, whether on inpatient units or through telemedicine. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, because I know that people who are listening to this are maybe they're in the early stages of starting their practice, or maybe they're just thinking about starting their practice. So I think it's just so important to be transparent about what those early days really look like, so that if people find themselves in that same position, they're going to be like, okay, this is normal. We can work with this. We can keep improving. We can keep going. And so that actually brings me to my next question, which is, how did you actually get patients through the door to your practice? If you're wondering how you can start your own telepsychiatry private practice that you can take abroad with you, then join us in our online course. This is where we walk you through the process step by step, and where you'll learn everything you need to learn to help you create a private practice that you can take abroad with you. You do not have to go at it alone. So check it out at hippocraticadventures.com/telepsychiatry from abroad. And doors open for registration on September 17th. So we'll see you there.
Well, I think what everyone will tell you in in a private practice is that it's really all about word of mouth. It's the strength of your referral network. And if you've just finished a residency or a fellowship, you actually do have a little bit of a referral network from your supervisors and other people that know you. But really, the biggest strengths of your referral network come as you establish your practice and start collaborating with other therapists, other psychiatrists, other primary care physicians, and then it starts to grow exponentially. But exponential growth sounds great, but when you don't have much to begin with, exponential growth takes a little bit of time to get those first few patients through the door. And that could be a little bit of a painful time.
Yeah. I remember you coming home from work and feeling sometimes like, is my practice ever going to take off? Because I'm just seeing like 1 or 2 patients in a week, and obviously that isn't sufficient. But that was initial. That was the first couple months.
Yeah, that was the first couple months, and then as every month it got a little bit better, and it got a little bit better, and then I started to know and understand a few things about marketing, so that made things better as well. And then I'd say it's probably right around the time before we went to Portugal that things took off, particularly because telemedicine became mainstream. And I was being very clear at that point that we were moving abroad. So right around that point is when things started to take off, and it was like, oof, thank goodness. I guess we can do this. It's not just gonna be this like jump off a cliff kind of leap of faith. I think we're gonna be able to fly at the end of this.
And so as you were building your practice, was there ever a time when you worried about whether you could keep getting enough patients, enough referrals. Were you worried when you transitioned abroad that some of your patients wouldn't want to see you? Or, obviously with COVID, that helped the transition to telepsychiatry visits. But as COVID got better, were you ever worried that a lot of patients would no longer want to see you through telemedicine and that they would prefer an in-person practice instead?
Well, at the very beginning, when, as you mentioned, like those first few months where I saw maybe 1 or 2 patients a week, I was like, how are we ever going to move abroad doing this? But then as I started to stack the different telemedicine moonlighting gigs, I was like, well, if my practice doesn't take off, we've got these things as a backup. And as I saw volume grow over time, I realized that there was going to be some critical point where I could take off all the telemedicine gigs that I had and really focus just in terms of my private practice. Um, COVID definitely, as tragic and awful as COVID has been, it really pushed people towards telemedicine. And that started to decrease my anxiety a bit. Although I did initially think, well, that's great, but what about when COVID ends? Are people going to want to go back to in-person care? What really changed for me is when the therapist that I was seeing, still am seeing from Portugal, um, went to only um, virtual visits. So I stopped seeing her in person. And I actually quickly realized, like, huh, virtual visits make a lot of sense. I actually feel like I connect better with her through virtual visits. It takes off this hour-long commute. I can show her around my office. I can just lay back in my own chair that I'm pretty comfortable in. Um, and I realized, if she went back to seeing me in person, I don't want to continue doing these visits virtually. And I figured if I'm like that, probably other people will feel that way. And of course, the pandemic wasn't just kind of a one and done. There were all these variants. There was, Omicron. There kept being these surges. And I think over time, people just got so used to telemedicine um, that my anxiety ended up going away. Because I realized telemedicine was here to stay for the
Yeah,
long
and I
haul. Yeah.
also I also imagine that there's always going to be a subset of patients who prefer in-person visits, and they're going to seek out psychiatrists or therapists who will see them in person. And there will always be a subset of people who would prefer the convenience of a telepsych virtual visit as well. So I think that also helps, that patients can have a preference in who they choose and the type of whether they want in-person or telepsych consultations. So yeah.
Absolutely. There are definitely some limitations too with telemedicine in terms of the patients that you might be able to see. And some patients just connect better in person. As a child and adolescent psychiatrist, it's kind of hard to do play therapy on the floor with a 6 or a 7-year-old through telemedicine, right? So there are definitely some limitations in terms of who you can see, and of course, controlled substances, prescribing those through telemedicine, particularly from abroad, you can't really do. So there are definitely some limitations, but telepsychiatry or seeing your psychiatrist virtually is just so convenient. And if a person can get comfortable with it, there's actually a lot of advantages. You can really bring the psychiatrist into your world in a way that's harder to do when you're going to the office and to their world all the time.
So now, 5 years into your private practice and 4 years living in Portugal, how is life abroad for you?
Um, I mean, I love it here. I don't know if if the people who are listening to this have ever been in Portugal, but it's a really lovely place, and the difference in climate between the freezing winters of New England and just kind of this warm, luscious climate here. The culture is just so laid back. I just I really love it here. There's also something to be said about the time difference, which, of course, it depends where people live. The time difference can be something to adjust to. Between Portugal and the East Coast, it's only 5 hours. So what that translates to is I can have a pretty chill morning where I hang out with the kids, take them to school, get my workouts in, go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, all the things that I really love to do. And then, like, I'm ready to start seeing patients in the early afternoon. And sometimes I'll see patients in the evening too, but I've kind of gotten accustomed to that. I don't think we'll be moving back to the United States anytime soon.
Yeah,
I love it here.
I don't think we will be. And how do you feel like the kids? We have a 7-year, well, actually, when we moved, we had a 3-year-old and a 10-month-old when we moved. So they were really young. How do you feel like they have kind of handled this transition and how they've adjusted to life now in Portugal?
Oh, I think they transitioned beautifully. I mean, they both speak better Portuguese than us, and we get complimented for Portuguese all the time, but their Portuguese is better than ours. They know all about the local sports teams, and they ask us who we support, and it's like, oh, we don't really follow soccer that much. No, they're basically completely integrated by this point. I think when our oldest was, because we moved, she was 3, right? When
3.5.
I think so, 3.5. I remember dropping her off to school that first day, and she was really scared. She was really scared, and she kind of said, "Scary, scary," as we were trying to drop her off. But then she saw this really nice and kind-looking person at the daycare was wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt, and she was like, "Oh, I love Mickey Mouse. Therefore, she must be really nice." And so, she actually went in without incident that day on her very first day. And then I remember, like, a week later at dinner time, she spontaneously said, because we speak French at home, she said, "Merci," which is thank you, of course, in French. She said, "Merci, c'est obrigada." Obrigada meaning thank you in Portuguese. And we're like, "Oh, wow, Zara, very good, Zara." And then she was like, "Scary, scary." So I think for her, the transition, the first couple weeks were a little bit tough, but I mean, she really adapted beautifully. Our younger one, like, didn't even notice.
Yeah, he was
Yeah,
10 months old. He had no idea.
yeah, he didn't notice.
And so actually a lot of psychiatrists, between your colleagues and your friends and folks in the Hippocratic Adventures community, they have actually been reaching out to you because they want to do it too. They want to be able to have their own private practice that they can do from abroad. And tell us about that. Tell us about your work with other psychiatrists.
Yeah, so we do have a guidance service through Hippocratic Adventures, and people can reach out to us in terms of how to build a telepsychiatry private practice, either from abroad or that they can take from abroad. So I've seen a lot of people and helped them build their private practices. It's actually been a lot of fun. The thing is that our guidance sessions are usually about an hour long, and it's a lot to cover in an hour, from rules and regulations to how to deal with time differences, how to think a little bit about your ideal patients, and what kind of EMR to get, and taxes, and all these things. So actually, to streamline the process, we're coming out with a course in terms of how to build your telepsychiatry private practice that then you can either take abroad or that you can start while you're abroad. And the idea is that we can really go in depth into all of these topics, both through video lessons, but with these adventure sheets that are kind of fun worksheets that really walk you through the different processes of your practice. With the intention of really spoon feeding even the most anxious psychiatrists in terms of how to have a really fun and productive private practice that they can take with them wherever they go.
And it's pretty thorough. I mean, we've both been involved in creating this course, and it's really step by step. I feel like we really lower the threshold in terms of what it takes to start a private practice that you can take abroad. We really kind of make it pretty straightforward, pretty transparent what that process looks like. And it's a pretty, I would say, like a incredibly thorough and helpful course that is also super digestible so that you don't get overwhelmed all of a sudden, because this whole transition can be super overwhelming. And I think we do a really good job of really breaking it down into key steps and really walking you through it. I think one of the reasons I really wanted us to come up and kind of create this course was because I really, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit more too, is I really wanted to give psychiatrists, fellow psychiatrists, I'm not a psychiatrist, but psychiatrists, fellow physicians, the ability to create a practice that gives them freedom, that gives them autonomy, where they aren't relying on the whims or policies of a company or an organization to allow them to work from abroad, but where they create this practice that where they enable themselves to work from abroad, so that they don't have to worry if the company changes a policy and all of a sudden remote work from abroad is no longer allowed, and poof, there goes your income, you know? So what were your kind of reasons for creating this course? Because it is very thorough. It took a lot of work to create.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working on this course for a year now. Somehow it's yeah, we've been working on this course for a while, so we've really kind of boiled down the most essential parts and then really done a deep dive on everything. In terms of what made me really want to create this course is it's essentially what it is that I wish that we had when we first started, right? When yeah, after January 2019, it was like, yeah, I really want to do this thing, but I have no idea how to do it. Is it even possible? Is it illegal? How do I get patients through the door? How do I tell patients I'm going abroad? How do I work with time differences? What EMR should I get? I mean, there were so many questions to answer that I think in building this, it's exactly what it is that I wish we had had after that trip to Spain. And I think the whole goal is to empower physicians, here in particular psychiatrists, because increasingly physicians across all specialties, including psychiatry, are kind of just being treated like workers in the American medical system, right? There's private equity that's surging. Medicare reimbursement is being cut to physicians. And it's hard to say no to some of these things when you don't have an alternative.
Yeah.
And the hope is this course really makes a very potent alternative available that'll empower psychiatrists to really live out their dream, either of moving abroad or of creating a private practice that gives them autonomy and flexibility, and to treat the patients that they went into psychiatry to do, and you know why they went into psychiatry in the first place. That's the hope.
Wonderful. So on that note, Emeric, I want to say thank you for really taking us behind the scenes of what it's really like to run a telepsychiatry private practice from abroad. I think really kind of taking us behind the scenes, opening the curtain, and letting us see what life is really like is incredibly helpful and powerful. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
So with that, I'm going to include links below to, if you're a psychiatrist and you want to learn more about this course that we're going to launch pretty soon, I'll include links below so that you can learn more about it and what exactly this course is about. And this is definitely, so if you're a psychiatrist wanting a private practice, wanting to move abroad, you're going to want to take part in this course. So we hope to see you then. And with that, we wrap up another episode of Discovering Where Your White Coat Can Take You. Make sure to like, subscribe, and really share this with your friends and colleagues, because this really helps us reach more physicians who want to move abroad and just don't know how. And if you want to learn more about how to start your own private practice from abroad, sign up for our webinar. It's on Tuesday, September 17th at noon Eastern Time. Sign up at hippocraticadventures.com/telepsychiatry from abroad.